At 72, a surgeon's hands are a ledger of every life they've touched. Mine were steady, but they ached with the ghosts of a long career. I thought I had made peace with all of them, until the one ghost I could never outrun showed up on my operating table with a ruptured aorta and a name I hadn't spoken since I was a girl. The final suture was a whisper of black silk against the pale, irrigated landscape of the man's heart. My hands, encased in the second skin of latex, moved with an economy born of 50 years and thousands of hours spent in this cold, bright room. One more pass. The knot must be perfect. Tie, cut, release. Anastomosis is complete, I said, my voice muffled by my mask, yet carrying the unmistakable weight of finality in operating room 3. The rhythmic, steady beep of the heart monitor was the only applause that ever mattered. Dr. Ben Carter, my resident for the month, let out a breath he'd clearly been holding for the last 10 minutes. His own hands, poised to assist, looked clumsy and oversized next to mine. He was a good boy, clever and eager, but he still treated the human body like a textbook. He hadn't yet learned it was a library of whispered, unpredictable stories. That was perfect, Dr. Reed, he stammered. It was adequate, Dr. Carter, I corrected, placing my needle driver on the sterile tray with a soft click. Perfection is a luxury we aim for. Adequacy is the standard that keeps the patient alive. Close him up. I stepped back from the table, my lower back protesting with a familiar dull ache. The scent of the room, a sharp metallic tang of blood layered over the sterile iodine and the faint ozone hum from the equipment, was more familiar to me than any perfume. I peeled off my gloves, my bare hands emerging pale and wrinkled. I flexed my fingers, feeling the ghost of a tremor in my right thumb. A new and unwelcome companion these last few months. A secret I kept between myself and the dawn. In the scrub room, the hot water was a welcome shock against my skin. I worked the soap into a lather, the harsh antiseptic smell of chlorhexidine a constant in my life. Ben came to the sink beside mine, still buzzing with post-operative energy. They call you the Weaver for a reason, he said, his face glowing with admiration. That running stitch on the graft? I've never seen anything so precise. I didn't answer, just focused on the methodical scrubbing of my knuckles. The nickname had followed me for decades. It was a compliment, I knew, but it always felt isolating. Weavers work alone, turning threads into a whole cloth that is admired from a distance. They don't get to feel its warmth. My office was a small, quiet space at the end of the cardiac wing, a world away from the controlled chaos of the OR. The worn leather of my chair sighed as I sank into it. The crack in the left armrest, a familiar groove against my elbow. Through the window, the ambulance bay flashed with the silent, pulsing lights of arrivals and departures. Most of my life had been spent in this building, under these fluorescent lights. I had sacrificed holidays, friendships, a marriage. For this. For the quiet satisfaction of a job done right. I was working through a stack of patient files, the crisp rustle of paper, a counterpoint to the distant hum of the hospital, when a sharp rap on my door broke the silence. Before I could answer, Michael Evans, the hospital's chief of surgery, pushed his way in. His face was grim. Evelyn, we've got an emergency inbound. Airlift from a regional hospital. I straightened, the weariness falling away, replaced by the familiar surge of clinical focus. What is it? Male, late 70s. Catastrophic aortic dissection, type A. Looks like it's ruptured. He slid a tablet across my desk. The 3D scan on the screen was a nightmare, a ballooning, shredded aorta. And there's a complication. Aneurysmal arch with a bovine trunk anomaly. It's a 1 in a million mess. I leaned in, my mind already running through the surgical steps, the potential points of failure. The approach would have to be unorthodox, the grafts custom trimmed on the table. It was the kind of complex high-wire act that had built my reputation. He's crashing fast, Michael said, his voice tight. The team at Mercy said he wouldn't survive the trip, but his daughter insisted. You're the only one on this coast who has ever successfully repaired this specific presentation. That case from '08, the one you published in the journal? I remembered. A butcher from downtown. It had been an 18-hour surgery. He's your case, Evelyn. If you'll take it, it wasn't a question. Not really. Ben appeared at the door, a physical chart in his hand, his eyes wide. Dr. Reed, the initial vitals are here. I took the chart from his trembling hand. The thin paper felt cold, official. I scanned the grim numbers, the cascading organ failure, the desperate measures the flight medics were taking. This man was already a ghost. My eyes drifted to the top of the page, to the patient information box, typed in stark, clinical font. Name: Vance, Arthur. The chart slipped from my fingers, scattering its papers across the floor. The sound was deafening in the sudden, absolute silence of my office. Arthur. A name I hadn't allowed myself to think, let alone speak, in 50 years. The name didn't just echo in my mind. It landed in my body like a physical blow. Arthur Vance. For a moment, the fluorescent lights of my office seemed to flicker and dim, the hum of the hospital fading to a dull, high-pitched ring in my ears. The world narrowed to the black letters on the white page scattered at my feet. "A ghost on a page, Evelyn?" Michael's voice cut through the fog, sharp with concern. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." I didn't realize I was on my knees until I felt the cold, unforgiving smoothness of the linoleum through my slacks. My fingers, the same ones that could tie a suture finer than a human hair, felt clumsy and disconnected as I gathered the scattered papers. Ben Carter rushed to help, his young face a canvas of confusion. "I'm fine," I said, the words feeling foreign in my own mouth. I forced myself to stand, my joints protesting. I placed the chart back on the desk, my hand covering the name as if the heat of my palm could erase it. "The case. It's just more severe than I anticipated. A plausible lie." Michael nodded, his expression relaxing into professional sympathy. "It's a monster. No one would blame you for passing. We could get someone from the Mayo Clinic on a plane, but he won't last that long. It's your call." He was giving me an out, a clean, ethical exit. Doctor is not emotionally fit to perform the procedure. It was a valid reason, one I could use without a shred of professional blowback. The woman inside me, the one I had buried under 50 years of sterile drapes and sleepless nights, clawed her way to the surface, screaming at me to take it. "Let him go," she whispered. "He left you. He told you this life you chose was a foolish hobby. He made you choose. Let this be the consequence." My mind flashed back to our tiny walk-up apartment. The air was thick with the smell of his pipe tobacco, a mix of cherry and cedar, and my own simmering resentment. He stood by the window, the city lights behind him, his face set in a mask of frustrated disappointment. He had just laid down his ultimatum, him or the scalpel. "This obsession of yours, Ev," he'd said, his voice laced with a condescending pity I would never forget. "This foolish hobby of playing doctor, it's not a life, it's a distraction." I could feel the cold weight of the doorknob in my hand as I left that apartment for the last time. The decisive, metallic click of the latch had been the closing of one life and the brutal, solitary birth of another. Now, the hand of fate, with a sense of irony that bordered on cruelty, had brought him here, to my table. He was no longer a handsome, dismissive man of 25, but a name on a chart, a ruptured vessel, a failing body. His life was reduced to a set of grim statistics, and I was the only person who could change them. "Dr. Reed?" Ben's voice was hesitant, pulling me back to the present. He held up his phone, showing me a text from the emergency department. "The flight landed. They're bringing him up. They say he only has minutes." I looked at Ben's face. He was pale, terrified, but his eyes were fixed on me, shining with a desperate, unwavering faith. He believed I could do the impossible. My team in the OR, they would be waiting, trusting me to lead them through a storm. This hospital, this life of discipline and sacrifice, it was the world I had built after Arthur tried to tear mine down. Walking away now wouldn't just be letting him die. It would be a betrayal of everything I had become in spite of him. It would be admitting in some small, final way that he had been right, that my ambition was nothing more than a hobby. The woman inside me fell silent. The surgeon took her place. I straightened my back, the familiar armor of professional resolve settling over me. My voice, when I spoke, was as crisp and steady as it was in the operating room. "That won't be necessary, Michael," I said, meeting his eyes. "Get R3 ready. I want a full perfusionist team and the largest aortic graft we have on standby." I turned to Ben, my focus absolute. "Prep him. I'm on my way." The scrub room was my sanctuary, a place of ritual and transformation. The process was always the same. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, I turned on the faucet with my elbow. The rush of water was a roar that momentarily drowned out the universe. I let the water run over my hands, feeling its heat soak into my bones, chasing away the chill that had settled deep within me. I took the sterile brush from its dispenser. The bristles were stiff, almost punitive, against my skin. With methodical precision, I began the ritual. Fingertips, nail beds, the spaces between each finger. The scratch, scratch, scratch of the brush was a familiar rhythm, a penance and a prayer. But tonight it wasn't cleansing me. It was excavating ghosts. Scratch. The memory of an envelope, thick and creamy, with the Johns Hopkins seal embossed in the corner. I'd held it like a holy relic. Arthur had plucked it from my fingers, scanned the acceptance letter, and let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Well, isn't that cute?" he'd said, tossing it onto the coffee table. "A little certificate for your hobby." Scratch. Palms, moving in a circular motion, just as I'd been taught 50 years ago. My mind conjured the sight of my treasured copy of Gray's Anatomy skidding across our apartment floor. Arthur had swept it, along with a stack of my other medical textbooks, from the dining table in a fit of pique. "There's no room for these in a home, Ev," he'd snapped, the sound of a spine cracking against a table leg echoing in the tense silence. "There's no room for this fantasy." Scratch. Up my forearms to my elbows, turning my arms under the stream of water. The soap foamed, its clean chemical smell doing nothing to wash away the memory of his final words. They hadn't been shouted in anger. They'd been delivered with a calm, surgical precision of their own, designed to sever all hope. He stood in the doorway as I packed my bag, his arms crossed. "You'll be alone with your ambition, Evelyn," he'd said, his voice quiet and certain. "See if it keeps you warm at night." I rinsed, the water washing away the soap but not the residue of the past. I held my hands up and backed into the operating room. The heavy door hissed open and swung shut behind me, a final, definitive seal between the world of memory and the world of flesh and blood. R3 was ready. The team stood in position, a silent, masked company of soldiers awaiting their general. Ben Carter's eyes met mine over his mask, wide and anxious. Dr. Petrova, the anesthesiologist, gave me a curt, professional nod from the head of the table. The air hummed with the quiet efficiency of well-oiled machinery, and in the center of it all, on the table, was the patient. He was completely covered in sterile blue drapes, an anonymous shape. The only visible part of him was a wide, sterile field of skin on his chest, painted a lurid, rusty orange with betadine. It wasn't a man. It was a problem to be solved. A vessel to be repaired. I approached the table. A nurse, her movements practiced and fluid, held out a sterile gown. I slipped my arms into it, and she tied it securely behind me. Then came the gloves, the soft, satisfying snap of latex as they sealed around my wrists. The final barrier. I was Dr. Reed now. Nothing else. I held out my hand. Scalpel. The instrument felt perfectly balanced in my palm, a familiar and steady weight. I looked down at the orange field of skin, at the body that was both a stranger's and the vessel of my oldest wound. The rhythmic beep of the monitor was the only sound. 1 beat, 2 beats, 3, my team waited. The world waited. My ambition hadn't kept me warm at night. He was right about that. It had, however, taught me how to hold a blade, and with a steady hand, I made the first incision. The high-pitched whine of the sternal saw was the first true violation. It's a brutal, necessary sound, and it's always followed by the ugly, splintering crack of the sternum giving way. The residents always flinch the first time they hear it. I hadn't flinched in 50 years. Ben worked the retractors, cranking them open to expose the thoracic cavity. The man's heart, slick and trembling in its pericardial sac, came into view. It was a weak, tired muscle. For the next hour, I worked with the seamless focus of a creature in its element. I placed the cannulas, rerouting his existence through the heart-lung machine. The rhythmic whoosh thump of the machine filled the room, taking over from the now silent heart. The acrid smell of cauterized tissue hung in the air as I dissected away the scar tissue, clearing a path to the great diseased vessel. The aorta. That's when the first wave of cold dread washed over me. The scans hadn't done it justice. The wall of the aortic arch, the magnificent vessel that should have been robust and supple, was bruised and translucent. It looked like old parchment that had been left in the rain, fragile and ready to disintegrate at the slightest touch. "Damn it," I muttered, my voice tight. "Suction," Ben leaned in. "Is it worse than we thought?" "The scans were optimistic," I said, carefully positioning a clamp far down the arch. "The tissue integrity is compromised. It's like trying to suture wet paper, and then it happened." As I gently palpated the vessel, seeking a viable spot to begin the graft, the unthinkable occurred. The bruised wall didn't just leak, it tore. A geyser of dark, arterial blood erupted, instantly flooding the chest cavity. The calm, controlled atmosphere of the OR shattered. Alarms shrieked to life, a cacophony of urgent, piercing tones. "Massive hemorrhage," Ben shouted, his voice cracking. "Pressure is crashing! I'm pushing blood as fast as I can." Dr. Petrova's voice was strained, cutting through the noise from the head of the table. My hands moved on instinct, jamming surgical gauze into the wound, trying to apply pressure. But it was like trying to dam a river with a handful of sand. The overwhelming coppery smell of blood filled the air, thick and suffocating. The surgical field, once so clear, was a churning sea of red. In that moment of blinding chaos, as my gloves became slick with his life, a memory ambushed me. It was so vivid, so complete, that for a fraction of a second, the OR vanished. I was 21, sitting with Arthur on a park bench. The sun was warm on my skin. He'd taken my hands in his, turning them over, tracing the lines of my palms. My hands, which I'd always seen as tools, instruments of my will. He'd looked at them with a fond, sad smile. "They're beautiful, Ev," he'd said, his voice soft. "Artist's hands, too delicate for cutting people open." My own hands, the ones currently buried in his chest, froze. A clamp, held between my thumb and forefinger, hovered uselessly over the wound. For one heartbeat, I was paralyzed by the staggering, brutal irony. The delicate hands he'd pitied were the only things between him and death. "Dr. Reed?" Ben's voice, sharp with terror, sliced through the memory. It snapped me back. I looked down at the chaos, at the blood, at my own motionless hand. I had hesitated. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, surged through me. "More suction." "I can't see the tear." I plunged a DeBakey clamp deep into the pooling blood, aiming for the source of the bleed. I tried to grasp the edges of the tear, to pinch the vessel closed. But the moment the metal jaws touched the aorta, the fragile tissue shredded further, widening the hole. My attempt to fix the problem had just made it exponentially, catastrophically worse. Chaos has a sound. It's the frantic squelch of suction trying to clear a field that won't stay clear. It's the sharp, metallic clang of an instrument dropped on the floor. It's the strained voices of a team watching their center of gravity, me, begin to lose the fight. The air was thick with the smell of blood, so potent it felt like I was breathing it in. "More lap pads," I snapped, my own voice sounding thin against the blare of the alarms. "I need to see." As Ben's hands moved to obey, a disembodied voice crackled from the intercom on the wall. A voice from another world, the world of waiting rooms and lukewarm coffee. "Dr. Reed?" "The surgical desk is calling for Dr. Reed." I ignored it. My focus was on the abyss in Arthur's chest. Cross-clamp isn't holding. The tissue is like wet tissue paper. It won't take a suture. Dr. Reed, the intercom crackled again, more insistent this time. A Miss Chloe Vance is in the surgical waiting room. She's asking for an update on her father, Arthur Vance. Chloe. The name struck me with the force of a physical impact. Our daughter, the child I had raised alone, the living, breathing testament to the life I had chosen. She was here, in this building, waiting. Suddenly, the anonymous, draped figure on the table was no longer just Arthur. He was Chloe's father, and my failure was no longer a private professional defeat. It was a family tragedy I was actively creating. It was in that moment of distraction, of a heart divided against itself, that the final catastrophe struck. The already erratic rhythm on the monitor spasmed, then dissolved into a chaotic, useless fibrillation. And then, nothing. The shrieking alarms were replaced by a single, desolate, continuous tone. The sound of absolute finality, flatline. We're losing him. Petrova's voice was grim. Fib, now asystole. No cardiac output. Starting compressions. Ben shouted, moving into position over the table, his face a mask of desperation. His hands, laced together, began to push rhythmically on the sternum of the man he didn't know was his mentor's ex-husband. A futile gesture. We all knew it. We couldn't stop the bleed, and we couldn't restart a heart that had nothing left to pump. Time seemed to slow down. I looked at the unwavering horizontal green line on the monitor. I looked at the frantic, useless efforts of my resident. I could call it, right now. Time of death, 11:42 a.m. I could wash my hands, walk out of this room, and face my daughter with the honorable, tragic truth. We did everything we could. The ghost of Arthur would be laid to rest. The wound he'd inflicted on my life would finally be cauterized. But Chloe's face swam in my vision. Her face, not as the accomplished woman she was now, but as a 5-year-old with scraped knees, looking up at me with absolute faith that I could fix anything. The surgeon, the mother, the woman, they all merged into a single point of unbending will. I would not fail, not here, not now. I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the dirge of the flatline tone with an authority that shocked even myself. Stop compressions! Ben froze, his hand still on the patient's chest. But Dr. Reed, I said stop. I turned to the perfusionist. Initiate deep hypothermic circulatory arrest. I want core temperature at 18 degrees Celsius, now. I looked at the circulating nurse. And get me the cryo clamp. The experimental one. A shocked silence fell over the room, broken only by the steady, damning tone from the monitor. Ben stared at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. Dr. Reed, the Reed procedure? You haven't performed that in over a decade. The neurological risk, the mortality rate is currently 100%, doctor. I interrupted, my voice as cold as the saline slush I was about to use. His brain has 4 minutes of oxygen left. The clock is ticking. Are you going to help me or not? There was no more debate. My command had reset the room, replacing panic with the sharp, cold edge of purpose. Ben, his face pale but his eyes now clear, moved to assist. The team became a single organism responding to my will. The frantic energy of trying to save a life was gone, replaced by the chilling, methodical process of orchestrating a temporary death. Core temperature is 25 degrees. 20! Dr. Petrova's voice was a steady metronome, counting down to 0. A nurse poured buckets of saline slush into the open chest cavity, packing it around the silent heart. The unnatural cold seeped into the air, and I could feel it through my gloves, a cold that felt ancient and absolute. 18 degrees, Petrova announced. We are at target. Circulatory arrest initiated. The steady whoosh thump of the heart-lung machine ceased. The last of the alarms were silenced, and profound, unnerving quiet fell over OR 3. On the main monitor, the flat green line remained, no longer a symbol of failure, but of a deliberate, calculated pause. We had stopped his life. The clock on the wall now represented a different countdown. We had, at most, 40 minutes before his brain would begin to decay from lack of oxygen, even at this temperature. Suction, I said into the silence. The field was now perfectly, eerily bloodless. Cryoclamp. Ben placed the instrument in my hand. It was a sleek, unfamiliar tool, humming with latent power. I positioned its jaws on either side of the shredded aorta, activating. A soft hiss and a plume of vapor rose from the tissue. A delicate lacework of frost spread across the vessel, rendering the fragile, torn edges rigid. It was no longer like wet paper. It was like frozen leather, brittle but workable. For the first time in an hour, I had a stable foundation. And then I began to weave. Time ceased to be linear. The ticking clock on the wall faded away. My world shrank to the 10-centimeter space at the end of my instruments. The only things that existed were the needle, the thread, and the frozen, waiting flesh. Each pass of the needle was a deliberate, unhurried decision. Each knot was a mathematical certainty. The frantic, desperate surgeon was gone, replaced by the weaver, working her loom in the silent void. My hands did not shake. My mind did not wander to the waiting room, or to the ghost of a man in a park, or to the daughter who might soon be an orphan. There was no room for anything but the work. The delicate, impossible work of suturing a vessel that had ceased to exist on a man who was, for all intents and purposes, already dead. I was not just repairing an aorta. I was arguing with fate, stitch by single, perfect stitch. The graft went in, a pristine white tube of dacron against the pale, frozen tissue. I sutured it into place, my movements a fluid, unbroken dance that felt both infinitely slow and impossibly fast. The last knot was as clean as the first. The repair was complete. It was a perfect textbook example of a procedure no textbook would ever dare to print. I laid down my needle driver. The sound was a soft click that seemed to echo in the vast silence. "Repair is done," I announced. My voice sounded rough, as if I hadn't used it in years. "Begin rewarming, slowly." The team stirred back to life. The perfusionist started the bypass machine again, this time sending warm blood trickling back into the frozen body. The slush was suctioned away. The long, agonizing process of bringing him back from the brink had begun. I stepped back from the table, my job, the part I could control, now finished. The frost on the cryoclamp melted, dripping onto the blue drapes below. Everyone's eyes were on the monitor, on that unwavering horizontal line, waiting, hoping. I looked at the perfect, almost invisible suture line on the graft. I had done all I could. The rest was up to the tired, damaged muscle that lay silent in his chest. "All right," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Let's see what we have." The silence in the operating room stretched into a taut, unbearable wire. 1 minute, 2. The perfusionist called out the rising temperature. 25 degrees, 30, 35. Still, the green line on the monitor remained stubbornly, unnaturally straight. Ben stared at it, his shoulders slumping with each passing second. The hope that had flared in the room was beginning to gutter and die. "Core temp is at 37 degrees, Dr. Petrova announced, her voice flat. "He's stable, but there's no spontaneous rhythm." This was the final hurdle. The plumbing was fixed, but the engine wouldn't turn over. "Internal paddles," I ordered. Ben's head snapped up. He placed the small spoon-shaped paddles in my hands. I positioned them directly on the surface of the heart, one on each side of the still, pale muscle. "Charge to 20 joules." A high-pitched whine filled the room as the defibrillator charged. "Clear," I said. The team took a half-step back from the table. I pressed the button. Arthur's body gave a single violent jerk. The muscle in my hands clenched, spasmed, and then went slack again. On the monitor, the line jumped, then settled back into its infuriating flatness. "Failure." "Again," I said, my jaw tight. 30 joules. The whine, the warning, the jolt. A flicker on the screen this time. A single chaotic wave that immediately dissolved. Ventricular fibrillation. It was a mess, but it was something. It was life. "He's trying," Ben whispered. "Don't try," I murmured to the heart in my hands. "Just do." Charge to 50. I delivered the shock. For a moment, there was nothing but the fading echo of the jolt. Silence. The straight green line. My own breath caught in my throat. Then, a single miraculous sound. Beep. A pause that stretched for an eternity. Beep. Another pause. Then another. Beep, beep, beep. A slow, steady rhythm began to sketch itself across the screen. Weak but regular, it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. A collective, audible sigh of relief swept through the room. Ben slumped against an equipment cart, his mask failing to hide the tears welling in his eyes. Dr. Petrova gave me a slow, deliberate nod of profound respect. The weaver had finished her work. The tapestry was whole. As Ben and another surgeon began the routine, anticlimactic work of closing the chest, the adrenaline fled my body, leaving behind a staggering, bone-deep exhaustion. I stripped off my gloves and mask, the cool, recycled air of the OR a balm on my sweat-drenched skin. I leaned against the cool metal of a counter, the full weight of the last few hours pressing down on me. I had wrestled with a ghost and, somehow, won. Ben approached me as I was leaving the OR. "Dr. Reed," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've read about procedures like that. But to see you, it was—" He shook his head, unable to find the words. "You saved him." "We saved him, Doctor," I corrected, though we both knew what he meant. "Now go finish your work." The walk to the surgical waiting room was the longest of my life. The sterile corridor felt like a tunnel between two worlds. Behind me was the world of science and certainty. Ahead was the world of emotion and the messy, tangled threads of the past. The waiting room smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. Chloe stood the moment she saw me. She was 45 with my eyes and Arthur's stubborn jawline. She rushed forward, her face a mess of fear and hope. "Mom, he's alive," I said. "The surgery was successful. He's in critical condition, but he's stable." The relief that washed over her was so total it buckled her knees. She sagged against me and I held her, my arms feeling clumsy and strange. We hadn't embraced like this in years. She pulled back, wiping at her eyes, her expression shifting from relief to a deep, unsettling confusion. "They told me what happened," she said, her voice quiet. "They told me only you could do it. After everything he did to you. The way he was. Why?" Her eyes searched mine, pleading for an answer that made sense. "Why would you do that for him?" I looked at my daughter, this woman who had only ever known me as a surgeon, as a force of nature. She had never known the young woman who had been forced to make an impossible choice. "Because it wasn't about him, Chloe," I said, my voice as steady and true as a suture line. "It was about me. It was about the oath I took, the surgeon I chose to be, instead of the wife he wanted me to be." Chloe stared at me, her mouth slightly agape. The simple gratitude in her eyes was replaced by something far more complex, a dawning, difficult understanding that seemed to rewrite the history of her own life right there in front of me. She said nothing. She didn't have to. I could see the question she was now asking herself. Who were her parents, really? A week passed. The hospital, in its relentless way, moved on. I performed 3 more surgeries: a routine valve replacement, a tricky pediatric transplant, a standard bypass. With each successful procedure, the memory of Arthur's chaotic, bloody surgery receded, becoming less of a trauma and more of a scar, a place where a mortal wound had healed into something stronger. Chloe visited him every day. We spoke briefly in the hallways, our conversation circling the vast unspoken thing that now sat between us. She looked at me differently now, with a kind of careful, quiet awe. They moved him out of the ICU and into the cardiac step-down unit on the 7th day. His recovery was slow, but it was steady. The nurses told me he was quiet, that he spent most of his time just staring out the window. That evening, after my final rounds, I found myself walking toward his room. I wasn't sure why. It didn't feel like a choice. It felt like the final necessary stitch. He was sitting up in bed, looking small and frail against the starched white pillows. The maze of tubes and wires was gone, replaced by a single simple oxygen cannula under his nose. The room was quiet, save for the gentle hiss of the oxygen and the soft rhythmic beep of the bedside monitor. He turned his head as I entered, his eyes tracking my slow approach. They were the same eyes I remembered, but the arrogant fire in them had been banked to a low, weary ember. I stood at the foot of his bed. For a long time, neither of us spoke. "My ambition," he finally rasped, his voice a dry rustle of sound. "It never kept me warm, Ev. Did yours?" I thought of the cold, lonely nights, the missed dinners, the empty side of the bed, the silence of my home, filled only with the turning of pages in medical journals. "No," I said. The admission was clean, without bitterness. It was simply the truth. He nodded slowly, as if I had just confirmed a long-held suspicion. He looked down at the thin blanket covering his lap, then back up at me, his gaze clear and direct. You really did it," he whispered, and the words seemed to cost him a great deal of effort. "You became the best." It wasn't a compliment. It was a concession, a final, quiet surrender in a war that had ended half a century ago. It was the acknowledgement I had spent my entire life pretending I didn't need. I gave a single, small nod. "Yes," I said. "I did." I looked at the steady, rhythmic pulse on his monitor, the pulse my own hands had restored. But my ambition built a world I could live in. And it just saved your life. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. I didn't look back. There was nothing more to say. The sutures were tied. The wound was closed. That night, for the first time in years, I did not bring work home. My house was quiet, filled with the scent of old books and the jasmine tea I brewed for myself. In my study, I opened a drawer and pulled out an old dog-eared photograph. It was me, at 23, on my first day as a surgical resident. My face was unlined, my hair was dark, and my eyes burned with a ferocious, terrified ambition. I looked so young, so determined to build a world of my own. I set the photo down on the desk and looked at my own hands, resting in the warm pool of light from the lamp. They were 72-year-old hands now. The skin was thin, mapped with veins and age spots. A slight, persistent ache hummed in the knuckles. They were the hands of an old woman, but they were not the delicate, useless things Arthur had once pitied. They were the hands that had guided 1,000 scalpels. They had held a dying heart and convinced it to beat again. They had faced down a ghost from the past and had not faltered. They were tired. They were aging. But they were, I knew in that quiet, peaceful moment, capable of miracles.